The first thing I noticed after buying the land was the silence.
On my
Not
rights
the peaceful kind of silence people imagine when they think about countryside living, but a heavy, almost unnatural silence that made everything feel bigger than it actually was. 40 acres of open land stretched in every direction,
I demand that you
untouched,
clean up this
unclaimed,
disgusting
and
field
completely free from
immediately.
the suffocating
It's an
rules of
eyesore and
suburban
a fire
HOA control.
hazard.
For the
How
first
dare
time
you
in
cross
years,
this
there were
boundary?
no neighborhood
You know the rules
regulations
about the
watching
wheat
every
field.
move.
Stay
No
out,
warnings
or I
taped
am
to
calling
doors.
security.
No committees
You can't
deciding
just
what
lock
color a
this
fence
gate.
should be
I
or
have
how high
every
grass
right
was
to be
allowed
on
to
this
grow.
property.
It was
Open it
freedom in
right
its
now.
rawest, most physical form. But freedom always attracts attention. The property sat just beyond the edge of an overly controlled residential HOA community, an area known for strict enforcement, endless complaints, and residents who seemed to thrive on controlling each other's lives more than living them. At the center of that community was one figure everyone quietly feared but publicly tolerated. A woman known only by reputation at first. The type of person who didn't just follow HOA rules, she enforced them like they were laws of nature. Every lawn blade mattered. Every parked car was observed. Every new homeowner was evaluated like they had committed a crime by simply existing. She wasn't elected power. She was self-appointed authority. And she ruled the neighborhood through pressure, complaints, and relentless surveillance of everyone around her. When news spread that someone had purchased the massive 40-acre land bordering the HOA zone, it didn't take long for curiosity to turn into obsession. Because this wasn't just land. It was escape. A break in the perfectly controlled perimeter she believed should extend forever. The purchase itself had been simple. No committee approval. No neighbor votes. No restrictions. Just a clean legal transaction outside the HOA jurisdiction. That alone was enough to disturb the balance. But what truly changed everything was what came next. Plans. The land wasn't meant to stay empty. It was going to be transformed into a private, fully independent estate, completely outside HOA authority. No shared roads. No communal rules. No outside interference. And the first structure to be built wasn't a house. It was a gate. A massive, reinforced, locked entrance at the only access point to the property. Heavy steel, industrial-grade hinges, and a security system designed to make one thing clear from the moment anyone approached. This land was not part of the HOA world. And nothing about it was open for negotiation. That gate changed everything. At first, it seemed like a simple boundary marker. Just a physical separation between controlled neighborhood life and unrestricted land. But to the HOA community, it felt like a statement. A challenge. A rejection of their authority. And to the woman at the center of it all, it felt personal. Within days of construction starting, subtle tension began forming. HOA activity increased. Drive-by inspections became more frequent. Vehicles slowed near the boundary line. Eyes lingered longer than necessary. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was surveillance. And then came the complaints. Not formal at first, just whispers, then calls, then carefully worded reports about visual disruption and unapproved structural development affecting neighborhood harmony. The irony was that nothing about the structure broke any rules, because it wasn't inside their jurisdiction at all. But that didn't matter. Because control is rarely about legality. It's about perception. As the gate rose higher each day, so did the tension. Workers on site began noticing small but unsettling details. People standing too long at the edge of the property. Cars idling just a little too close. Silence that didn't feel passive, but observant. And always, at the center of it, one presence became increasingly consistent. The HOA enforcer. She didn't appear loudly at first. She didn't confront anyone directly. Instead, she observed from a distance, watching the transformation of the land like it was an invasion rather than a purchase. To her, the gate wasn't just metal and structure. It was defiance made visible. As the final bolts were tightened and the locking system installed, something shifted permanently. The boundary was no longer theoretical. It was real. It could be seen. It could be touched. And it could not be crossed without permission. That realization hit the neighborhood like a silent shockwave. Because for the first time, the HOA had something it couldn't easily control. The gate didn't belong to them. The land didn't belong to them. And whoever stood behind that gate was not subject to their authority. But what nobody expected was how deeply that simple fact would escalate everything. Because in neighborhoods like this, control is not just expected, it's enforced socially, emotionally, and relentlessly. And now, for the first time, someone had stepped completely outside of it. The gate was locked. The land was sealed. And the woman who had built her identity on control was already beginning to react. Not openly. Not yet. But something inside the HOA structure had already started to crack. And what came next would turn a simple property boundary into a full-scale confrontation that no one saw coming. The land was supposed to represent freedom, but freedom rarely arrives without resistance. As the days passed after the gate was installed, the atmosphere around the property began to change in ways that were subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once they accumulated. The HOA community, tightly controlled and heavily monitored, had always functioned like a closed system. Every decision flowed through approval structures. Every change was discussed, debated, and filtered through layers of informal authority. Even though it wasn't legally a governing body in the traditional sense, it had become something more powerful in practice, a social machine that enforced conformity through pressure instead of law. And now, that machine had encountered something it couldn't process. A boundary it didn't control. A land it couldn't regulate. A structure it couldn't approve or reject. The 40-acre property stood outside all of it, yet its presence disrupted the illusion of total control the HOA had built around itself for years. At the center of this imbalance was the woman everyone in the community had grown used to deferring to in subtle ways. Not because she held official authority, but because she had slowly inserted herself into every layer of neighborhood decision-making. Over time, she became the unofficial gatekeeper of what was acceptable and what wasn't. She didn't just enforce rules. She interpreted reality for others. And now, that interpretation was being challenged. What made the situation more volatile was the contrast between the HOA-controlled neighborhood and the newly acquired land. Inside the community, everything was regulated to perfection: uniform lawns, identical fences, controlled aesthetics, and a constant undercurrent of observation. Outside it, the 40-acre land was the opposite. Raw, open, and untouched by collective agreement. It represented unpredictability, independence, and most importantly, the absence of permission. That absence was what triggered the tension. Because in environments built on control, independence is perceived not as freedom, but as defiance. And defiance spreads. The first internal disruption wasn't visible. It was psychological. Residents began questioning small things they had never questioned before. Why certain rules existed. Why enforcement felt so aggressive. Why approval was always required for even the smallest changes. The gate became a symbol of that questioning. A physical reminder that life could exist without oversight. Construction crews working on the property began reporting unusual behavior from the HOA side. Not direct confrontation, but persistent presence. Vehicles passing slower than necessary. People standing near property lines longer than normal. Conversations that stopped abruptly when noticed. It wasn't hostility yet. It was observation turning into fixation. And fixation always escalates. The HOA enforcer, however, experienced something different. For her, the gate was not just an object. It was a disruption to the system she believed she maintained. A system where boundaries were socially enforced, where deviation was corrected, and where order was preserved through collective pressure. This gate did not ask for permission. It did not seek approval. It simply existed, locked, immovable, and independent. That independence felt unacceptable. Behind the scenes, quiet efforts began forming. Subtle attempts to reinterpret rules. Discussions about property lines. Suggestions that the structure might visually impact community cohesion. None of it had legal weight, but that was never the point. The goal was influence, not law. Pressure, not authority. Meanwhile, the property itself was transforming. The locked gate was reinforced further. Security systems were upgraded. Access was restricted to a single controlled entry point. Every improvement reinforced one message: this space was not negotiable. And every reinforcement intensified the reaction outside. The emotional tension grew in waves rather than moments. There were no sudden explosions yet, only accumulation. Like pressure building behind a sealed door with no visible release. Inside the HOA community, residents began aligning themselves without formal discussion. Some supported the idea of boundary respect, but others began mirroring the enforcer's growing frustration. The presence of unrestricted land felt like a challenge to their structured existence, even if they couldn't articulate why. The more controlled their environment was, the more the uncontrolled land disturbed them. And that disturbance spread silently. What made the situation more unstable was that nothing could be directly acted upon. The property was legally outside jurisdiction. There were no violations, no infractions, no enforceable complaints that could hold weight. But that legal limitation did not reduce emotional escalation. It intensified it. Because when control systems lose legal power, they often shift towards psychological pressure instead. And that shift was already happening. The enforcer began increasing her presence near the boundary. Not crossing it, but observing it with increasing intensity. Each visit lasted longer. Each observation became more focused. Each moment spent watching the locked gate reinforced a growing sense of personal challenge. The gate was no longer just a structure. It was a message she felt directed at her. And messages, in her world, were meant to be answered. Inside the 40-acre property, however, the response remained the same: silence, construction, reinforcement, and expansion. No engagement. No reaction. Only continuation. That contrast, between silent independence and escalating observation, created the foundation for what was about to become an unavoidable confrontation. Because in systems built on control, silence is never interpreted as peace. It is interpreted as resistance. And resistance, once identified, always demands a response. The locked gate stood unchanged, but everything around it had already begun to shift. And the shift was no longer reversible. By the time the third week arrived, the situation was no longer about land or property lines. It had evolved into something far more personal, something emotional, unstable, and deeply rooted in perception rather than reality. The 40-acre property remained untouched in its legal status, but its symbolic weight inside the HOA community had grown beyond anything anyone expected. What began as a simple boundary dispute had transformed into a psychological divide between two worlds, one built on collective control, and one built on absolute independence. And that divide was starting to affect people in ways they didn't openly admit. Inside the HOA-controlled neighborhood, daily life began to subtly shift. Conversations at community gatherings carried an undercurrent of tension. Residents who once accepted every rule without question now found themselves pausing slightly before agreeing. Small doubts began to surface, even if quickly suppressed. The existence of the locked gate had introduced something dangerous into the system: comparison. Before the gate, most residents didn't think about alternatives. Their environment was normalized through repetition and enforcement. But now, every glance toward the boundary reminded them that another kind of existence was possible, one without approvals, restrictions, or oversight. That realization created discomfort. And discomfort always seeks direction. The HOA enforcer, already deeply invested in maintaining order, began experiencing a shift that was less social and more psychological. What started as authority-driven concern slowly turned into personal fixation. The locked gate was no longer just a structural issue. It became a recurring presence in her thoughts, something she revisited mentally even when not physically near it. The more she observed it, the more it represented something she could not define but strongly felt: loss of influence. And for someone who had built identity through influence, that loss was destabilizing. At the same time, the land itself was evolving in complete contrast. The construction inside the 40 acres progressed steadily, but without interaction, commentary, or external validation. The work was deliberate, structured, and entirely self-contained. No HOA oversight. No community feedback. No negotiation. Just execution. That contrast between constant internal approval systems and complete external independence created a growing emotional bridge, not between agreement, but between tension-filled awareness. People on both sides were now fully aware of each other's existence, even if they were not directly engaging. And awareness changes behavior. Subtle changes began appearing near the boundary. Increased presence from HOA members at odd hours. Longer observation times. More frequent slow drives along the edge of the property. Even residents who had no official role found themselves drawn toward the perimeter, as if the gate itself exerted a quiet pull. It wasn't rational. It was psychological gravity. The locked gate had become a focal point for something the HOA community was not equipped to handle: the idea that control was optional. Inside that emotional shift, resentment slowly formed, but not in an explosive way. It grew like pressure under glass, spreading through conversations, assumptions, and interpretations. The gate was no longer seen as neutral infrastructure. It was being redefined socially as an act of defiance. And defiance, once socially accepted as real, becomes justification for escalation. The enforcer's behavior reflected this shift most clearly. Her visits to the boundary became more structured, more deliberate. Each visit carried a sense of evaluation, as though she were mentally constructing ways to reassert balance in a system that felt increasingly unstable. The gate itself never changed. It remained locked, reinforced, unmoving. But its meaning inside the HOA world was changing daily. What made the situation more volatile was that there was no direct confrontation. No single event that could be pointed to as the beginning of conflict. Instead, everything was gradual, emotional build-up without release. And that kind of build-up is always more dangerous. Because it creates inevitability. Within the HOA community, subtle divisions began forming. Some residents viewed the property as harmless independence, while others began aligning emotionally with the enforcers' growing frustration. Not because they were instructed to, but because group psychology naturally gravitates toward shared emotional narratives. And the dominant narrative forming was simple. Something outside the system had refused to participate in it. That refusal felt like imbalance. And imbalance demands correction. Meanwhile, on the 40-acre side, nothing changed in response. There were no visible reactions, no attempts at engagement, no acknowledgement of the growing tension outside the gate. That absence of reaction became its own kind of provocation. Because in emotionally charged environments, silence is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It is interpreted as confidence. And confidence, when unchallenged, becomes perceived dominance. That perception completed the emotional bridge between both sides. Two systems now fully aware of each other. One built on control. One built on independence. And between them, a locked gate that symbolized the entire conflict without ever speaking a word. The emotional tension was no longer growing. It was stabilizing at a breaking point. And everyone involved, whether they admitted it or not, could feel it approaching. By the fourth stage of escalation, the conflict was no longer silent. It had begun to surface in visible, undeniable ways that the entire community could feel, even if they didn't fully understand what had triggered it. The locked gate at the edge of the 40-acre property had stopped being just a boundary structure. It had transformed into a public symbol, one that people now drove past more slowly, stared at more deliberately, and discussed more frequently in low, cautious tones. The HOA, once confident in its invisible control over behavior and environment, was now reacting in ways that were becoming harder to hide. What started as subtle observation turned into structured presence. Vehicles began appearing near the boundary at predictable intervals. Not random pass-bys, but organized monitoring patterns. Residents who never previously showed interest in the outskirts of the neighborhood now found reasons to pass that specific stretch of road repeatedly. It was no longer curiosity. It was surveillance becoming normalized. And at the center of it all, the HOA enforcer's influence became more visible than ever before. Her presence was no longer subtle. It carried weight now, an unspoken signal that something needed correction. Even without direct action, her mere appearance near the boundary seemed to shape the behavior of others. People slowed down when she was present. Conversations shifted tone. Attention focused toward the locked gate as if it had become an unresolved problem that demanded resolution. The emotional pressure inside the community had reached a new stage, public acknowledgement. What had once been private frustration was now becoming collective awareness. And collective awareness always escalates tension. The 40-acre property, however, remained unchanged in behavior. No engagement. No response to external pressure. The gate stayed locked, reinforced, and completely unyielding. Construction deeper inside the land continued without interruption, reinforcing the idea that whatever was happening outside had no influence inside. That contrast created friction. Because visibility without interaction creates imbalance in perception. And imbalance spreads faster than facts. Within the HOA community, conversations that were once quiet now carried sharper undertones. Residents began interpreting the gate not just as a physical structure but as a challenge to the entire system of neighborhood governance. A question was forming beneath the surface of discussions. If one property could exist without rules, why couldn't others? That question was dangerous. Not because it was loud, but because it was contagious. The HOA response shifted accordingly. What had been informal observation began turning into structured attempts to assert relevance. Notices were discussed. Interpretations of guidelines were debated. Even though jurisdiction did not extend to the property, language was being shaped to suggest influence where none legally existed. This was not about enforcement anymore. It was about reassertion. Meanwhile, the enforcer's focus became more intense. The locked gate had evolved into a psychological anchor. Each visit reinforced her perception that the situation was not just a boundary issue but a personal disruption to the order she believed she maintained. Her presence near the property became more frequent and more deliberate, almost ritualistic in its consistency. Each appearance carried the same silent message: observation would eventually lead to resolution. But the property did not respond. That silence created frustration that spread beyond individual emotion and into social atmosphere. The HOA community began shifting from passive observation to active discussion. The gate was no longer just noticed, it was analyzed, debated, and emotionally loaded with meaning far beyond its physical purpose. Some residents began expressing concern that the presence of uncontrolled land so close to the neighborhood undermined the sense of stability they relied on. Others quietly admired the independence it represented but avoided saying so openly. The system was beginning to split internally. And internal division always increases external pressure. The turning point came when HOA activity near the boundary increased to its highest level yet. Multiple residents gathered at different times, no longer just passing by but stopping long enough to observe, discuss, and mentally evaluate the structure that separated two completely different systems of living. The gate, once just infrastructure, had become a public stage for unresolved tension. Every glance at it now carried interpretation. Every interpretation carried emotion. And every emotion carried momentum. What made this stage especially unstable was the lack of response from the 40-acre property. No engagement, no negotiation, no acknowledgement of escalating attention. That absence created an imbalance in psychological expectations. Because in most controlled environments, attention demands response. And when it doesn't receive one, pressure builds outward. The enforcer began to feel that pressure more directly now. Her movements reflected a growing urgency, not rushed, but increasingly purposeful. Each visit to the boundary felt less like observation and more like evaluation of a situation that was refusing to align with expectation. And expectations, when repeatedly unmet, transform into personal stakes. By this point, the gate was no longer a structure dividing land. It had become a line dividing identity. On one side, a system built on collective control. On the other, a system that did not participate in control at all. And between them, a locked gate that refused to open, refused to negotiate, and refused to acknowledge the pressure building around it. The tension had reached a public stage. And public tension always demands escalation. Even when no one is ready for it. By the time the tension reached its peak, the situation no longer felt like a simple dispute over property boundaries. It had transformed into something deeper, more layered, and far more unsettling beneath the surface. What began as HOA irritation had evolved into a full psychological standoff, but what no one outside the inner circle realized was that the conflict was not purely about control anymore. It was about fear. Fear of what the locked gate represented. Fear of what it removed. And fear of what it exposed. Because over time, something unusual began surfacing in the behavior patterns of the HOA leadership and those closely aligned with its enforcer. The reaction to the 40-acre property was not consistent with normal boundary disputes. It was emotionally charged in a way that suggested something more personal was embedded in the resistance. Behind closed discussions and quiet internal conversations, a truth began to form, one that reframed everything. The HOA system had, over the years, expanded its influence far beyond simple community guidelines. It had become a structure that depended heavily on psychological agreement rather than legal enforcement. Residents followed rules not because they had to, but because they had been conditioned to believe deviation carried consequences, social, financial, and emotional. Control only worked as long as everyone participated in it. And the locked gate disrupted that participation entirely. The revelation wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly through observation, behavior analysis, and the increasing instability of responses. The enforcer's fixation on the property wasn't just authority-based, it carried traces of identity dependence. The system she helped maintain was not just administrative for her, it was personal validation. Every compliant resident reinforced her sense of order. Every deviation threatened it. And the 40-acre property represented the most complete deviation she had ever encountered. No negotiation. No submission. No acknowledgement. Just independence, physically defined and permanently locked behind reinforced steel. As this realization spread within the HOA structure, reactions shifted from frustration to something closer to emotional destabilization. Because when control systems realize they are not absolute, they begin to reveal the insecurity beneath them. The gate was no longer just a boundary. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of influence. And that reflection was uncomfortable. Inside the 40-acre property, nothing changed in response to this internal unraveling. Construction remained steady. Expansion continued. Security remained uncompromised. The absence of reaction now carried a different weight than before. It no longer felt passive. It felt final. As if the system inside the gate had already moved beyond the need to respond. That realization intensified emotional pressure outside. Because unacknowledged authority is more destabilizing than direct confrontation. The HOA community began to fracture internally in subtle but visible ways. Some members started questioning whether the level of reaction being directed at the property was justified. Others doubled down, interpreting the independence as a threat that needed stronger containment through social pressure. But the truth had already taken root. And once it takes root, control systems begin to lose coherence. The enforcer's behavior became increasingly erratic in structure, though still restrained externally. Her presence at the boundary became more frequent, but less about observation and more about confrontation without contact. It was as if she was waiting for a response that would never come. And that expectation itself became the breaking point. Because the gate was not designed to respond. It was designed to end interaction entirely. That is what made it irreversible. By the end of this stage, the revelation was no longer hidden within behavior patterns. It was visible in atmosphere, in tension, in the way the HOA system itself began to lose unified direction. The locked gate had not just divided land. It had divided belief. And belief was far harder to control than property. The final shift did not arrive with noise. It arrived with exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but systemic exhaustion. The kind that happens when pressure is applied without release for too long, until the system holding it simply can no longer maintain shape. The HOA community, once unified in structure and expectation, had reached that point. The attempt to socially reassert control over the 40-acre property gradually lost momentum. Not because of a single defeat, but because of sustained non-response. There was nothing to engage with. Nothing to correct. Nothing to pressure into compliance. The gate remained locked. And that permanence changed everything. Over time, the emotional intensity that had built up around the property began to dissolve, not into resolution, but into resignation. The system could not continue escalating without feedback. And without feedback, escalation collapses. The enforcer's presence near the boundary became less frequent. Not due to victory or acceptance, but because the psychological anchor that once defined her focus had stopped producing reaction in her internal framework. There was nothing left to push against. And systems built on pressure cannot function without resistance. Inside the 40-acre property, expansion continued quietly. The land transformed gradually into a fully independent space, defined entirely by internal decisions rather than external influence. The locked gate remained the only visible connection point to the outside world, and even that connection was symbolic rather than functional. It did not open. It did not invite. It did not negotiate. It simply existed as a permanent boundary between two incompatible systems of living. The moral impact of what had unfolded became clearer only in hindsight. Control systems built on collective agreement are powerful, but only as long as participation is voluntary or socially enforced. The moment a single element removes itself entirely from participation, the illusion of total control begins to fracture. Not through conflict, but through absence. The 40-acre property did not defeat the HOA through confrontation. It defeated it through non-engagement. And that distinction changed how everyone interpreted the entire situation. For the residents, the experience left a lingering shift in perception. Some returned to normal routines without change. Others quietly carried a new awareness, that structure and freedom can exist side by side, but not under the same assumptions. For the enforcer, the impact was more internal than visible. The system she had built her identity around had encountered something it could not absorb, influence, or reshape. And in that encounter, the limits of control became undeniable. The locked gate stood as the final symbol of that limit. Not as an act of aggression. Not as a challenge. But as a boundary that refused to participate in systems that required participation to function. In the end, nothing dramatic destroyed the HOA's influence over that space. It simply stopped working where the gate began. And that silence, more than any conflict, became the defining resolution. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement is not what is said. It is what refuses to respond at all.